So welcome to our fourth video on overhead costing. So in our previous video, we have discussed three important issues as far as overhead costing is concerned. We looked at the allocation and classification of overheads. We looked at apportionment and we looked at apportionment of overheads. We looked at assigning overheads, or we looked at on how to account for overheads from services center. So we looked at the four methods that are used when you are accounting for overheads from service centers. We had the direct method, where we said that if you use the direct method, the assumption is that all overheads are used in production. So you just ensure that the overhead from your product from the service centers are absorbed by the production departments or the production units. Where we looked at that. Then we looked at step down, and we said in the step down, the overheads can be apportioned to a service department, but at the end, all the overheads must be apportioned to production department. So if you have department X and department Y as the service department, when you apportion for X, then all the overheads remaining in Y should be apportioned to production department. Then we looked at the reciprocal method or repeated method, and in the repeated method, we have said that when you are apportioning the overheads, you can apportion X will apportion to Y, Y will also apportion to X. Then the remainder, if the figure becomes very small, then the whole amount is apportioned to production department. So we had an example on that, and I hope you have looked at that. So I want us to continue with our discussion. We are still looking at accounting for overhead cost. So please look at the method we have gone through and try to do this illustration, that is illustration number 2 and illustration number 3, that are related to overhead cost to production. So you will go through this. I think these are three production department. It is almost similar to what we have looked at. These are three production department, and we have two service department. So the overhead centers, this is how they are using. It's almost similar to what we have looked at in our previous discussion. So there is no big difference. So for practice purpose, it's better that when you are practicing, try to practice all the four methods that we have talked about. You never know where a question can come from. So for practice purpose, please ensure that you practice all the four parts that we talked about in apportioning overhead from service centers. So it is similar, only that in this one, it is asking to use simultaneous equation, which is also very simple to what we have looked at. You relate, it means if this one is B is getting 0.2 from A. So service A is giving 0.2 to A, service B is receiving, service A receives 0.2 from B, and the service A receives 0.1 from B. So you can do this, you can go through this, and you can do it based from the previous example that we have looked at. So this is another illustration. In this case, it is a bit different from the one we have looked at. We have got three departments, A, B, C, D, and two service department X and Y. The following are data extracted from this. So we have rent and rate, we have general lighting, indirect wages, we have power, we have depreciation, we have sundry expenses. So these are the direct wages. So this one you can allocate directly to the service center. And then horsepower for horsepower of machine. So those are, you can use them when you are absorbing. Cost of machinery, production hours worked, floor space. So this one, these direct wages, they're okay. You don't need to apportion. But horsepower will help you to apportion expenses for general lighting or for power. Power, you can use the horsepower to apportion. So these are going to be these will help you to determine the apportionment base. So remember what we discussed, you need to know the apportionment base for a particular overhead. So this one is how the service department is used. So it's like similar to what we have looked, 40, 30, 20, 10, it's almost same. So you are supposed to prepare a primary and secondary distribution analysis using repeated distribution, using the direct method, using step down. Please ensure that you go through all those ones. So your first step will be able to know the overhead for each center. So remember what we looked at. You have to first apportion the overheads to particular cost centers or to particular cost units, in this case for particular cost center. So after apportioning the overhead for particular cost centers, then you can apportion the overhead from the service centers to production centers. So it is similar to what we have looked at, only that this one is a bit general. So the last part that we are going to discuss in this chapter is the absorption of overheads. So as we said, once you have finished computing those overhead costs, then what you need to do is to assign the overheads to a cost unit. So meaning you are absorbing your overhead cost to a cost unit. You want to know what is the cost per what is the overhead cost per the 1 unit that has been produced. So when in this case, we needed to compute the cost or the overhead cost per given unit. That is what we are calling absorbing the overhead cost. So you are determining the cost per given unit that you have. So these are different ways under which you can determine. You can determine the unit of output, where you have the overhead divided by 1 unit. If it is direct labor, you will have overhead divided by the total labor hours. Machine hour, it will be overhead divided by the total machine hours. Percentage of material cost, it will be overhead divided by the material cost. So these are different ways under which you can compute the overhead absorption rate, the rate of overhead that you are going to use to compute your production cost. This is a simple example that you can look through using the previous formulas that we have talked about. Then you can be able to compute this one. So if you are calculating the overhead cost per unit, you will get this total overhead cost divided by the number of units. If you look at the overhead cost in terms of material cost, it will be this divided by this. If you are looking at the overhead cost in terms of labor hours, it will be your total overhead of this divided by the total labor hours. So if you are looking at it in terms of labor cost, still it will be the total overhead cost divided by the total labor hours. If you are looking at in terms of machine hours, it will be the total overhead cost divided by machine hours. So this one you can calculate. It is not very complicated. You can go through it. So you can as well go through this example, which is similar to what we have talked about. So let me introduce this one briefly, under and over absorption. We shall discuss it more in more details when we are looking at marginal costing and absorption costing. We shall discuss it in more details. when we talk of under absorption, because when we are calculating an overhead rate, we use a standard estimate. So because you use a standard estimate, in some cases you may overestimate or you may underestimate an overhead. So if you have overestimated an overhead, it means you absorbed more overheads than what you were supposed to have incurred or to what you have actually incurred. In that case, if you have overabsorbed an overhead, then the difference will be recognized as a gain because you incurred more expense than what you were supposed to have incurred. That is an overabsorption. So if it's an under absorption, if you come to under absorption, you observed, you under absorbed the overheads. For example, you had estimated to produce 10,000 units, and the overhead that you included was calculated on 10,000 units. But when you went to production, you produced 9,000 units. We are saying, for example, if your normal production was supposed to be 10,000 units, that was the normal production on which you calculated the overhead cost. Then in actual, you produced 9,000 units. So in that case, it means these 9,000 units will have a high cost than what you have, because 10,000 and 9, there is a difference of 1,000. So the 1,000 will have an under absorbed cost. Then if the normal production was supposed to be 10,000, that was the normal production on which you calculated the overhead cost was 10,000. And then you actually, the normal production was 20,000 units, or the normal production was 15,000 units. In this case, there is an over absorption of overheads. So if you have an under absorption, you must recognize the overhead cost. However, if you have an over absorption, then you must recognize a gain of over absorbed cost. So we shall discuss these ones in more details when we are discussing marginal costing and absorption costing in our chapter number 7. Please go through this activity, and it is similar to what we have been discussing, and compute the overhead absorption rate. So this is the end of our 4th chapter, which was about overhead costing. So please, as I said in our prior video, please ensure that every day you log in